A Calculation and the Weight, chapter 14. Now the world was living on two levels. There was an overt public level and a covert secret level. On the overt level, the world's business proceeded serenely, innocently, and in its normal fashion. Men worked, died, loved, and rested in their accustomed ways. But alongside this normal world, and ignored by it, the covert world went about its huge task of bringing two war plans to readiness. At that moment, the covert, counterpoised world of war was in a waiting stage. Its war dance had come to a high level of preparation and then stood arrested, held in a miraculous balance, a marvelous, intricate suspension brought about by suspicions, intentions, information, and lack of information. Rather good paragraph on a number of levels. Of course, we get this sense here of tension being developed by virtue of the fact that we have the world on the brink of war, but not yet, of course, erupting into war. What we're really seeing here is this vast war machine Leviathan being brought to the point of action, but held in suspension, just short of that, the eruption into essentially Armageddon. Let's have a quick look at the language form and features here. The opening sentence serves functionally as a simple topic sentence, two levels, and then it expands upon that by juxtaposing the two obvious terms, overt and covert. And then the third sentence, have a look at this one. On the overt level, the world's business proceeded serenely, innocently, and in its normal fashion. Men worked, died, loved, and rested in their accustomed ways. It's one of those sentences that we can accord a particular structural label to. Naturally, it's the balanced sentence structure that we're looking at. We're not dealing so much here with sentences in terms of length, of course, but more with their structure. In this case, the structure pivots around the colon, doesn't it? And you have two halves that essentially work reciprocally. They complement each other. They work to reinforce each other. So in the first half, we get that sequence of adverbs, everything happening in a serenely and innocent fashion. And then we get the second half of the sentence, basically giving us a short elaboration of it, asyndetically, of course, conjured for us, worked, died, loved, and rested in their accustomed ways. The language, by the way, here is also rather subtle, because, of course, we're getting such juxtapositions as died and loved, which is a vaguely ominous juxtaposition, but at the same time captures for us what's going on globally in the world outside. This is what's actually being prepared for us here. This sort of dual image, a double vision of what's going on in the world. And what's going on in the world is primarily a tension and a contrast between those who are aware of this sword of Damocles suspended over the world, almost ready to drop, and those who are obliviously conducting their quotidian rounds. But alongside this normal world, and ignored by it, the covert world went about its huge task of bringing two plans to readiness. And now we have a longer sentence to conclude the paragraph, which gives us a sense of the scale of activity that's being brought to bear. The covert world, the covert counterpoise, sharp alliteration, I'm sure you picked up there. World of war, continuing the alliteration somewhat, but I think more incidental, in a waiting stage. It's war dance, a personification that captures with it this sense of something that is, again, rather wry, a rather twisted form of humor, isn't it? A war dance. Naturally, of course, we see this being used in terms of perhaps indigenous tribal populations with their war dances, carrying with it perhaps a subtle overtone of something savage. Here, though, this is cleverly juxtaposed with the idea of it being something aesthetically appealing too, and we've encountered that term before in the ironic description of machinery, technology, and ultimately of weaponry. Its war dance had come to a high level of preparation and then stood arrested, held in a miraculous balance, a marvelous, intricate suspension. Again, familiarly structure. We see this use of triple construction, stood arrested, held brought to a high level of preparation, stood arrested, held in miraculous balance. This is a feature that combines well with a long sentence because it creates a sense of accumulating force, accumulating detail and activity, bringing us to this pitch, this peak of preparedness, of lethal readiness. So held in a miraculous balance, and now the language takes on that term we saw before, that rather ironically appealing imagery, marvelous, intricate suspension, which is, of course, something that should really rather horrify as a description, if you like, of the machinery that can unleash apocalypse. We've seen this so many times earlier on. Brought about by, and once we turn back to asyndeton, don't we? Suspicions, intentions, information, and then, of course, the subtle pause before we get the last phrase, and lack of information, which takes us back, if you think about it, to the first chapter, doesn't it, in some ways, because that was called the translator, wasn't it? And we remembered how in that chapter we began to see the possibility of this theme of communication being unfolded for us. The idea that this is one of the dire shortcomings of the Cold War era, the lack of knowledge, understanding, communication between the two giant superpowers. And therein lies the terrible delicacy of that balance of power, because ignorance itself can create deep-seated suspicions and fears, which in turn, of course, can be the triggers for war. So the lack of information, which in terms of what we've been seeing thus far in our study, the idea of information, is something that's almost complacently accepted as the norm in terms of the SAC, the Strategic Air Command, and indeed the whole of the American war machine. The idea being that they have this big board, which provides us with so much information that's fed into it from satellites all over the world and various other sources, that we have the information we want. Because really, if you think about this as an idea, as a theme being explored in the text, it's subverted, isn't it? Because it starts off, the whole sense of crisis begins with what is essentially a UFO, doesn't it? An unidentified flying object. They don't know what it is. They have this massive machinery and technology to let them know what's going on in the world, but they still can't fathom everything. The writers are making us aware of the fact that despite our technological genius and all of the marvelous array of machines and equipment we are still ignorant in so many ways. Let's move on. They waited. They waited in conference rooms, in war rooms, at rocket silos, in combat information centers on aircraft carriers, on submarines lying in muck at the bottom of the ocean, in fighter planes, in ready rooms, at computing consoles. Again, a longer sentence, making use of anaphora, of course. And at the same time, we're getting this feeling here of the sheer scale of what is going on, giving us a sweeping movement across the globe, really. 1 minute, we're in an information center like a war room. And next minute, we're in a submarine at the bottom of the ocean. The next minute, on the ocean in aircraft. The next minute, above it in fighters. Spanning the globe, the tentacles of mankind's savage machinery reaches out across the globe. Even men in motion were waiting. If you look at the first 3 sentences of this paragraph, again, a feature of style that we always ought to keep in mind, variation of sentence length. They waited is the first sentence, merely 2 words. The next one repeats it, doesn't it? Picking it up from the end of the previous sentence and then moving now into reusing it at the end of this third sentence. Over Russia, fighter planes rose in waves, flew toward the edge of Soviet airspace and waited. Rockets came up from deep pits and waited. Missiles were trained towards the east and waited. Radar sets were warmed up and their operators waited. Conventional anti-aircraft weapons were readied and manned and waited. Of course, I'm pretty sure you by now could easily identify the use of epistrophe here. It's reversing the order of repetition that we found in the previous sentence where it's anaphora. Now it's at the end rather than the beginning of the series of phrases or clauses. In this case, it's occurring at the end of the sentences, isn't it? It's an almost exaggerated repetition, one could say, but certainly it does reinforce the idea of mankind teetering on the brink of disaster, of a cataclysmic eruption into nuclear war. It also takes us back, if you like, much earlier in the novel, to Cassio's own description of this moment of anticipation, this moment of, shall we say, activity held in suspension or restrained energy. That actually was where we saw the analogy between men in their aircraft or in their silos or wherever they may be at the point of readiness, but forced to wait. He compared it to a sprinter on the start line, waiting for the crack of the pistol, endlessly never coming. And here we have that same sense. It's a nerve-wracking tension that must be applied, of course, to those involved in it, but they've been conditioned with it, apparently capable of withstanding the almost unbearable pressure. On 2 continents, whole armies of men, fleets of planes, scores of bizarre weapons were brought to a hair trigger of preparation and carefully restrained. Again, you get that triple construction, don't you? Armies, fleets, scores, etc. Once more making use of the asyndeton as well, building up the sense of once more the magnitude and the dimension of what's going on across the globe.